the town of Bridgewater has not fully awakened when a fire is already burning behind one of the houses facing the street. Water slowly heats inside a large vessel. Malted grain that has been germinated, dried, and crushed is poured into another container and mixed with the hot water. Wooden paddles repeatedly stir the thick mash, and the room begins to fill with the damp, sweet smell of malt. The liquid is drained away from the spent grain and transferred into another vat to cool. Yeast is then added. Within a few days, grain that could have become bread or porridge will instead become ale, a drink purchased every day by people throughout the town. From outside, this appears to be a business that should be very difficult to lose money on. The ingredients are simply grain, water, and yeast. The brewing equipment can be used repeatedly. One large vessel of ale can be divided into dozens or even hundreds of individual sales. Customers finish drinking it and return the next day. Demand for ale in medieval England was also enormous. Grain was not only baked into bread or cooked into thick soups. Large quantities were brewed into ale. Some monasteries provided allowances of as much as a gallon of ale per person each day. Near the end of the 13th century, the household of Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, purchased an average of approximately 85 gallons every day. At Framlingham Castle near the end of the 14th century, daily consumption was close to 78 gallons. If an entire town drinks ale every day, does the person standing beside the brewing vat simply turn grain into profit? In February of 1401, a widow named Denise Marler died in Bridgewater. The will she left behind did not resemble the property list of an ordinary household. She left half of a property, a complete set of brewing vessels with a furnace, 3 sacks filled with malt, and most of her business equipment to her servant Rose. She also gave several large lid brewing vessels to a church, a priest, and 2 religious houses. Her daughter Isabel received 2 more lead vessels, a copper pot holding roughly 3 gallons, a frying pan, a mortar and pestle, and the proceeds from 1 brewing. Marler also left silver tableware, drinking cups decorated with silver, clothing, chests, white wool, and a considerable quantity of cash. Brewing equipment and raw materials formed a major part of her estate. For Denise Marler, commercial brewing was clearly not an occasional sale of surplus ale. It had become a mature business capable of producing property, cash, and a large stock of equipment. This might appear to answer the question immediately. Selling ale was obviously extremely profitable. But Marler's will tells us only what one successful operator owned at the end of her life. It does not tell us how much grain, fuel, time, and labor had already been consumed before a single vessel of ale could be sold. Nor does it reveal how many other brewers in the same period earned only enough to supplement their households or lost weeks of work when a batch turned sour, grain prices increased, or a pricing violation resulted in a fine. The real question is therefore not whether anyone in the Middle Ages became wealthy by selling ale. It is why Denise Marler was able to accumulate wealth when most brewers did not become like her. We first need to separate the different businesses hidden inside the phrase medieval brewery. In early 14th century England, customers did not usually purchase ale from a specialized factory with a huge chimney and rows of identical barrels. A great deal of ale was produced inside ordinary households. Wives, husbands, children, servants, and apprentices carried ingredients, heated water, stirred malt, cleaned vessels, and then sold the finished drink directly to neighbors or supplied it to people who served food and drink. Around the year 1300, commercial brewing was still frequently a household sideline. Many of the people responsible for brewing and selling ale were married women. Historical records commonly describe them as brewsters. Income from brewing was mixed with spinning, farming, retailing, and unpaid household work. It could not easily be separated into a modern wage or a modern business profit. This helps explain why Marler's will included both brewing equipment and white wool. Brewing may have generated most of her wealth, but she may also have participated in spinning or other household industries. Medieval households did not register every activity as a separate company. The home was also a warehouse. The kitchen prepared family meals while heating the water required for commercial brewing. A servant performed domestic work but might also clean vats, move malt, and sell ale. The fact that family members did not receive an explicit cash wage did not mean that their labor had no cost. Only when we move from the front of the house into the working space behind it do we see the assets the business actually required. The first was the furnace. Brewing required large quantities of heated water. The fire had to burn long enough for soluble sugars and other material from the malt to enter the liquid. The fuel consumed during one brewing could not be recovered merely because several gallons of ale later failed to sell. The brewer also required cauldrons, wooden or lead vats, mashing tubs, wooden paddles, buckets, measuring vessels. A small household might use existing kitchen equipment, keeping the cost of entry relatively low. An operator supplying the market regularly required larger vessels. The larger the vessel, the more malt could be processed in one brewing. The same fire, cleaning, preparation, and labor could then be spread across a greater quantity of ale. This is why the large number of vessels in Denise Marler's estate is so important. She did not leave behind expensive ornaments. She left productive capacity. 3 sacks of malt meant that the next brewing already had raw material. The brewing vessels and furnace meant that her successor did not need to build a working production space from nothing. Half of the property meant that Rose received more than tools. She received a location in which brewing, storage, and customer service could continue. Even so, the item that usually tied up the most money was malt. Brewing did not transform nearly free water into an expensive drink. It began by purchasing valuable grain and accepting processing losses and sales risk in exchange for a higher but uncertain return. In the late autumn of 1310, officials in Oxford investigated local grain prices and used them to set legal ale prices. High quality, medium quality, and poorer wheat were selling at close to 8 shillings, 7 shillings and 4 pence, and 6 shillings and 8 pence per quarter. Barley was approximately 5 shillings per quarter, while oats were around 2 shillings and 8 pence. Officials set the price of ordinary ale at roughly 1¼ pence per gallon, or as much as 1½ pence under another method of sale. Historical estimates suggest that 1 bushel of grain might produce approximately 7½ to 10 gallons of ale. The actual yield varied according to the grains used, the strength of the drink, and the brewing method. We can now follow one representative brewing. This is not Denise Marler's surviving recipe, and it is not a complete reconstruction of her account book. The following model uses Oxford grain prices, historically plausible yield ranges, and regulated ale prices to examine a small commercial batch made from 3 bushels of grain. Suppose the brewer uses 1 bushel of wheat, 1 bushel of barley, and 1 bushel of oats. At representative prices from the period, the grain costs approximately 22 or 23 pence. If the 3 bushels each produce 9 gallons of ale, the final yield is around 27 gallons. Sold at 1¼ pence per gallon, the batch generates approximately 33¾ pence in revenue. At first, 22 pence of grain appears to have become more than 33 pence of ale. The selling revenue is roughly half again as large as the raw grain cost. But this has not yet included malting, grinding, fuel, yeast, wear on the vessels, cleaning water, transport, or selling expenses. Suppose those additional cash costs consume another 5 pence. The real cash contribution from the batch is now only 6 or 7 pence. Even those 6 or 7 pence do not yet pay the household members who brewed, carried, heated, cleaned, and sold the ale. If the actual yield is only 22 or 23 gallons, or if several gallons turn sour, leak away, or remain unsold, the remaining return can disappear very quickly. Only when the yield approaches 30 gallons and the entire batch is sold promptly at the permitted price. The gross difference between the grain cost and the ale revenue can therefore appear large. The true operating surplus depends on how much saleable ale each bushel of malt produces. The wake. This is why brewing skill itself had commercial value. If the water was not hot enough, the brewer failed to extract enough fermentable material from the malt, and part of the grain was wasted. If the temperature was too high, the result could also be damaged. If the vessels had not been properly cleaned, contamination from the previous batch could enter the next. If the liquid cooled too slowly, the risk of spoilage increased. If the yeast was weak, fermentation might proceed slowly, produce an unpleasant flavor, or fail to create a drink customers were willing to purchase. Medieval brewers did not understand microbiology. They nevertheless understood that the same quantity of malt did not always produce the same quantity of good ale. A failed batch was not merely unpleasant to drink. The malt could not be recovered. The fuel had already burned. The household had already supplied the labor. Customers could still refuse to purchase the result. Traditional English ale was generally brewed without hops. It therefore did not keep or travel as well as hopped beer. The operator needed to sell it quickly to nearby customers and could not easily store it for several months while waiting for the market to improve. During the late 14th and 15th centuries, hopped beer from the Low Countries increasingly entered the English market. It kept longer, traveled better, and was more suitable for larger-scale production. It gradually began to change the structure of the older household ale trade. Unhopped ale was therefore a business that depended heavily on speed of turnover. When a batch reached its best condition, the brewer needed to inform customers immediately. Neighbors, workers, travelers, and food sellers came to the house to buy it, or members of the household carried it out for delivery. If the batch sold quickly, the next brewing could begin. If it sold slowly, fermentation continued. The flavor changed, and inventory that should have become cash began to lose value. A vessel filled with ale appeared to be an asset. When the contents could not be sold, it became a container holding sunk costs. Even so, strong daily demand gave brewers an important advantage. Ale was both a drink and a source of calories. Ordinary households, manors, monasteries, and great noble establishments all required continuing supplies. Demand did not appear only during festivals, as it might for luxury cloth or expensive ornaments. During the 1330s, the aristocratic household of Elizabeth de Burgh could use roughly 8 quarters of barley and mixed grain each week for brewing. Each quarter reportedly produced around 60 gallons. During the December festivities, monthly output could exceed 3,500 gallons. A large household could organize this production internally. Ordinary urban families without sufficient equipment, malt, time, or servants purchased ale from commercial brewers. The demand was real. The price, however, was not determined entirely by the brewer. England's assize of bread and ale linked permitted ale prices to grain prices. Local officials, manorial courts, and ale tasters inspected the price, quantity, and quality of the drink. The ale taster was expected to determine whether the ale was fit to drink, whether it was being sold at the approved price, and whether the operator was using correct measures. Violations were reported to the court and could produce fines. These controls protected customers, but they also generated revenue for local authorities. Because brewers were repeatedly inspected, accused, and fined, brewing became one of the best documented forms of medieval women's work. For the brewer, the system created a familiar problem. When grain prices increased, the legal ale price could be adjusted. But the adjustment did not necessarily match the brewer's actual costs immediately or precisely. The malt may already have been purchased at a higher price. Firewood may have become more expensive because damaged roads reduced supply. A large vessel might suddenly split. If the brewer raised the price without authorization, used a short measure, or sold ale that failed to meet the required standard, she risked a fine. Some fines were small. Operators may even have treated repeated penalties as a normal cost of doing business. But when one brewing produced only a few pence of surplus, a single fine could consume the entire return from the batch. The other side of regulation was that local authorities did not necessarily want to drive brewers out of the market. A town needed a continuing supply. If the legal price was set so low that no one wished to brew, residents would quickly become dissatisfied. Officials, therefore, attempted to permit some reasonable gain while preventing operators from exploiting grain shortages and daily demand to impose excessive prices. The question was not whether ale should produce a profit. It was who possessed the authority to decide how much profit was reasonable. We can now return to Denise Marler's operation. Why was she able to become more successful than an ordinary household brewer? The first reason was the scale of her equipment. Possessing several large lead vessels, a furnace, and a complete set of tools meant that she could produce more ale in a single brewing. The same fire, the same cleaning cycle, and the same round of preparation could be spread across a greater output. A small brewer might retain 6 pence from one batch. With larger vessels, Marler's contribution per brewing could increase several times over, while the labor required would not rise at exactly the same rate. The second reason was continuity. A household that brewed occasionally might enter the market only when it needed money, when malt remained unused, or when a festival created extra demand. A permanent operator could build a regular customer base, understand seasonal patterns, and prepare the next batch before the previous one had completely sold. At Rotherfield in Sussex during the 1370s, dozens of people brewed ale for sale at some point. Most participated only occasionally. The number of genuinely continuous commercial operators was much smaller. The third reason was the method of sale. Selling an entire vessel wholesale to an innkeeper or food seller brought money back quickly and reduced the labor of retailing. The brewer surrendered part of the possible margin in exchange for faster turnover. Selling directly by the gallon or in smaller measures could produce a higher unit price. It could also be combined with food sales, seating, or longer customer visits. But retail created more measuring, more credit accounts, and more opportunities for disputes. A customer who drank today did not always pay today. Regular customers, neighbors, or other traders might place purchases on account and settle later when they obtained cash, grain, or another useful commodity. For the customer, this was credit. For the brewer, it was inventory that had already disappeared and revenue that had not yet entered the cash box. The malt seller might demand cash. The firewood supplier might demand cash. Once the ale had been consumed, the brewer could do nothing except wait for a promise to be honored. The account book might show strong sales while the business still lacked enough coin to purchase the next quantity of malt. The considerable cash mentioned in Marler's will is therefore important. It indicates that she did not merely possess equipment. She had successfully converted a significant portion of her sales into resources that could be stored and reinvested. The fourth reason was the use of household and hired labor. Marler left the principal brewing operation to her servant Rose. This suggests that Rose probably understood how the business worked in practice. Brewing knowledge did not exist only in a written recipe. The timing of the fire, the condition of the mash, the cooling period, the vessel most likely to leak, and the customers most likely to pay immediately were all learned through daily work. By giving the equipment to Rose, Marler transferred a working income-producing system. This also reminds us that Marler's wealth included the labor of Rose and other members of the household. If the servant received low cash wages, or if part of her compensation came through food, lodging, and and the expectation of inheritance, the apparent operating surplus would look larger. This does not mean that the profit was imaginary. It means that part of it may have come from labor that was not fully valued at a modern market wage. We can now place a medium-sized commercial brewing operation into 3 different years. This is not Marlar's complete annual financial statement. We do not know how much malt she used in each brewing or exactly how many times she brewed during a year. The following model continues to use 3 bushels per batch and assumes that a normal successful brewing leaves approximately those 8 pence are calculated after malt, fuel, and some direct costs. They still include compensation for the labor of the operator's household and do not fully account for property rent, replacement of major equipment. In a strong year, grain supplies remain stable. Malt prices do not increase sharply. Town markets and festivals create heavy demand. The operation completes 50 brewings during the year. Most batches sell quickly. The vessels rarely remain unused for long. Continuous production allows the furnace, cleaning, and preparation labor to be used efficiently. At 8 pence per batch, the year produces 400 pence, or £1 13 shillings, and 4 pence of cash contribution. Spent grain and other byproducts may still be used as animal feed or for other household purposes. For a small operator using an existing house and relying on household labor, this is a meaningful supplementary income. For someone with larger vessels, wholesale customers, and several sources of revenue, the real scale could be considerably greater. In this kind of year, the brewer can purchase more malt, repair vessels, acquire another copper pot or lead vat, and invest some of the cash in property, textiles, or other goods. In an ordinary year, the operation completes only 30 successful brewings. Some batches sell slowly. Several customers buy on credit. One vessel requires repair. At the same 8 pence contribution, the entire year produces 240 pence or £1. Neighbors still see smoke from the brewing fire on a regular basis. Customers continue buying ale, but that £1 includes hundreds of hours of carrying, heating, cleaning, selling, and managing by members of the household. If their labor were fully priced in cash, the apparent profit would become much smaller. The operation has not lost money. It is also far from producing extraordinary profit. In a weak year, a poor grain harvest pushes up the cost of malt. The operation can complete only 16 brewings. In an effort to keep customers, the brewer does not reduce production as sharply as the cost increase might justify. 2 batches suffer serious losses because of fermentation or storage problems. A court fine removes several more pence. The average contribution falls to roughly 4 pence per batch. The entire year produces only 64 pence, or 5 shillings and 4 pence. The furnace still occupies space. The vessels still require maintenance. The household still contributes labor, but the operator may no longer have enough money to replace equipment. If the next quantity of malt must be purchased for cash, the business may stop even though customers still exist. These 3 scenarios explain why enormous consumption of ale did not automatically create enormous wealth. Ale sold frequently, but the contribution from each batch was not necessarily high. Equipment could be reused, but replacing it required substantial cash. The ingredients appeared simple, but the business depended on valuable grain and fuel. Customers returned every day, but they could also purchase on credit every day. Inventory could sell quickly. It could also lose value quickly. Real profit came from rapid turnover, consistent output, reliable customers, and strict control of losses. It did not appear automatically when water was combined with malt. During the 15th century, the structure of the industry began to change further. London's brewers received a royal charter from Henry VI in 1438 and formally organized themselves into the Brewers' Company. The company could elect officers, manage the affairs of the trade, and take a more stable position within the city's commercial system. At the same time, hopped beer continued to compete with traditional unhopped ale. Hops added bitterness, but they also improved preservation and transport. A product that kept longer could be brewed in larger batches, sent to more distant markets, and stored while awaiting wholesale buyers. This required larger brewing vessels, more barrels, more malt, more reliable fuel supplies, and more initial capital. As production expanded, brewing gradually moved away from an occasional female household sideline toward a more professional, capital-intensive, and increasingly male-controlled commercial industry. Around 1300, customers commonly bought ale from household businesses run by married women. By 1600, the leading professional brewers in London and many other towns were more often men. This change did not occur because men suddenly discovered a better recipe. The business itself had changed. Small batch ale relied on the household kitchen, local customers, and rapid sale. Large-scale beer required greater equipment, capital, storage, transport, and formal trade connections. When income depended increasingly on scale, the people who controlled capital and institutional rights acquired the advantage. The market still drank beverages made from grain. The method of earning money shifted from personally producing one more batch to controlling more capacity, more barrels, and a wider distribution system. This is also what makes Denise Marler's wealth so revealing. Before that large-scale transformation had fully occurred, she already possessed many of the characteristics later associated with professional brewing operations. She had property. She had several sets of brewing vessels. She had a furnace. She had raw material inventory. She had a servant who possessed the knowledge required to continue the business. She had cash and other assets that could be passed to her heirs. She did not simply sell ale and consume all the proceeds in daily life. She converted operating cash into durable vessels, a share of a house, valuable objects, and productive capacity that could continue generating income. One batch produced by an ordinary brewster might temporarily supplement the household budget. Marler's operation had begun to become an inheritable asset. So was selling ale in a medieval brewing workshop really enormously profitable for someone who used ordinary household cookware and brewed only a few batches each year? Usually not. Brewing might produce enough cash to pay rent, purchase clothing, or support the family during months when other income was weak. But malt, fuel, spoilage, and household labor consumed most of the apparently attractive sales revenue. For an operator with large vessels, regular customers, continuous production, and direct retail sales, brewing could become a very good business. For someone who also controlled property, wholesale distribution, credit, storage, and trade organization, selling ale could produce genuine wealth. The most profitable brewer did not simply charge more for every gallon. Legal prices, customer purchasing power, and competition limited that possibility. Instead, she made the same fire serve more malt. She kept her vessels empty for as little time as possible. She turned the ale into coin before it lost its value. She then turned those coins into another vat, another sack of malt, and another share of property. Denise Marler's will appears to be a household list filled with copper pots, lead vessels, and silver objects. From the business side, it is a fragment of a balance sheet. The furnace represented productive capacity. The malt represented the next batch of inventory. The vats represented reusable capital. Her servant Rose represented the skill and labor required to keep the system operating. The cash showed that at least some of the ale had successfully left the vessels and returned to the operator's hands before it turned sour, leaked away, or disappeared into unpaid credit. On the surface, the medieval brewery sold grain, water, and yeast. What it truly managed was the race to turn a vessel of ale into reinvestable cash before the drink lost its value.